Now, Novara Media is on the left of the political spectrum. Aaron Bastani was one of its founders. So we've heard Ian Duncan-Smith, who firmly, on the centre-right of British politics. You've heard what David Lammy had to say. It pretty much was code, wasn't it, for keeping us or making us more closely aligned to the EU than we are today.
Well, it was very clever. I thought it was very astute politics. It does take a little bit of reading between the lines. It came across as professional, slick. It felt a bit, Back to the Future, a bit sort of Blairite in a lot of the language, multilateralism and whatnot.
Isn't that what Starmer wants the Labour Party to be?
Yeah, and I think there is a subtext there, which you're right to highlight, which is about broadly aligning ourselves with the European Union, but like you say, not touching that political hot potato of EU membership. Super interesting. I mean, we could talk about, I suppose, the foreign policy choices that have been made outside the EU. I think lots of people on the right and the centre, and probably the centre-left, they bash Johnson, but they don't bash him for his foreign policy choices so far.
But
so it's an interesting
Well, it's
line.
interesting, isn't it? I mean, I'm one of the most frustrated Brexiteers in the country because they haven't delivered some of the things I wanted. But, the AUKUS deal with Australia taking the lead on Ukraine, these are all things we couldn't have done or wouldn't have done as full EU members.
Well, Lammy talks about the AUKUS deal. They want to build on it. They want to stay in the Pacific. They want to align with the EU. They want to reform the Security Council. There's a lot there. It's very ambitious.
But you can't do it all.
You can't, no. It's very ambitious.
But the Labour Party itself, it fought the last election, wanting a second referendum.
Yeah.
They're basically rejoiners, aren't they, at heart?
Well, they are, yeah. People like David Lammy, Keir Starmer, that is utterly central to who they are as politicians, as people, as voters, even if they weren't in politics, those are the kinds of people they would be. But I think, Nigel, and this is probably something you've observed and been surprised by in the last few years, I certainly have, Keir Starmer is ruthless. He is ruthless. This was a chap on the pro-EU second referendum demonstrations in 2019, their standard bearer, their tribune, and now he's saying to the Red Wall, I will never rejoin the EU. And like you said earlier, I believe him. I don't think Labour plans to take Britain back into the European Union. So that ruthlessness has surprised me. And I think it's probably surprised a lot of people on the right too, because they saw Keir Starmer as a very different kind of politician.
And he's basically kicked Corbyn out of the party.
Oh, he has been utterly ruthless. He's been, he could teach Machiavelli a thing or two.
And what kind of Labour government would it be? They're talking about putting VAT on private school fees, getting rid of non-doms. They're going to be even higher tax than the Conservatives, aren't they?
But those two things you just mentioned, you might not like them, some of your viewers might not like them, but they are quite popular and they're quite small. They're not huge things.
They don't affect a huge...
Precisely.
7% of the population send their kids to private schools.
But it's not increasing income tax. But the thing is, Nigel, with the state of public service in this country, all the problems we have, ambulance waiting times, any waiting times, getting a doctor's appointment, etc. My suspicion is, just to cover the basics now, we're going to have taxes increased to a level that really Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were talking about before 2019. If you want all of these nice things like they were 15 years ago, and that isn't the argument Labour's making right now to the public. They're talking about these little tiny things that fundamentally don't really impact many people.
So closer to the European Union, he made it very clear that our foreign policy would be aligned to the EU. He talked about China briefly in the speech. Ian Duncan-Smith has been one of the people in Parliament leading the charge, saying we should be very scared of China. Some call him paranoid. I don't know where Labour stand on this, do you?
I don't. It's a very dynamic situation. This was a big intervention today about the relationship between the universities and whatnot. A few points, though. British universities are really dependent upon Chinese students. There's no two ways about that. Without them, a lot of them can't keep their heads above water. The reason for that is that Ian Duncan-Smith and his pals in the Conservative Party increased tuition fees 300% in 2010, but also cut government spending to universities. So they depend on Chinese students.
Well, there were no tuition fees until Labour brought them in.
Quite.
It was Mr Blair that brought them in and massively expanded the numbers going to university.
But I find it strange to say that, well, universities are dependent upon funding from Chinese institutions or Chinese students. True. Well, you enabled that situation, which I find rather surprising, rather counterintuitive. Labour's message on China, I'm sure we'll hear something. Like I say, the speech today was impressive, slick, professional. They didn't drill into too many details on anything, including China. I'm sure that'll change.